helping us with this event and the past and future events that we will have and will hold working together. It's been a terrific collaboration. Tonight, it's my privilege to introduce Valerie Graham. Valerie is a nationally recognized expert in Spanish colonial art who lectures frequently. She holds a master's degree in art history from Hunter College in New York City. As an art dealer specializing in the colonial period since 1987, she has assisted in the development of many public collections, including at the Denver Art Museum and the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art in Santa Fe. Valerie has previously lectured as part of the Alianza series at the Denver Art Museum on the subject of attributing a single work to Jose Campeche. And this talk is partly as a result of the great interest in Senor Campeche and his work among members and other enthusiasts that were inspired by her talk. So please extend a warmest welcome to Valerie Taylor.
Sort of hobnobbing with an almost court painter was not something you would expect in the Spanish Empire. And this goes to prove, actually, that there was quite a sense of upward mobility in the islands for certain, and also on the mainland of the Spanish dominions. Forward, back. This is another of his paintings. He obviously was into pageantry, and there was some pageantry also in Puerto Rico. You'll see a little bit of what I mean by that coming up. But he got Campeche started in portraiture in earnest in the late 1770s and 1780s. This is a self-portrait that Valerie painted when he was living in Puerto Rico. He painted himself as a barefoot peasant banana seller. And it's unlike most of his other pictures, but when you see his accomplishments, it's kind of wonderful, intimate look at someone who might otherwise be dressed like a courtesan, and here he is. About the date on that painting, and we think it's about 1776 to 8 when he was in Puerto Rico. But here is another self-portrait of Valerie in his finery, in his Spanish finery, in his studio in Puerto Rico, and behind him is a shipwreck, which we can interpret today as his sort of meditation on his exile. But you can see see his painting technique, very loose brush, very, very, very lively images, lots of silks and taffetas and glistening things. And this is a later, after he released Spain, a later portrait of the wife he eventually married, and we hope that he sort of calmed some of his romantic romantic adventures when he got married. But he painted his young wife, whom he obviously loved very much. But the painting is full of glazing, what we call glazing is thin layers of paint that are applied over each other, and sometimes are visible. The underpainting is visible under the overpaint. But you can see the beautiful glazing in the background, and on her face, for instance, and her décolleté. And these hats are just, you know, full of pearls and feathers and silk and roses. They are English and French inspired at this point. We're getting near the French Revolution, and of course Marie Antoinette, etc. But the Spanish really adopted, this woman was actually French by birth, so the Spanish adopted a lot of French fashions, and the Bourbon dynasty was ruling Spain at the time, and they were French. This work appeared only about 10 years ago in Spain, and it was owned by members of the family, the Urrutia family, who were actually went to Cuba, and certain family members went to Cuba. Her father, Doña Maria's Catalina's father, was a jurist in Havana, and he became mayor of Havana. His brother was also a jurist, and she married a Spanish gentleman, Juan Gabon, who became governor of Puerto Rico. So she moved with him to Puerto Rico. And this is the beginning, when these paintings resurface after being lost for many years or in private collections that no one knows about, we begin to understand the chronology of his work. And by 1788, he was quite an accomplished painter. While this is very dignified and quiet, it's also a very intimate look at the wife of a governor who is dressed in absolute up-to-date European finery. He was painting primarily European subjects, which is really interesting because they were all upper-class people. And as soon as this date, he died in 1809. As soon as this date, as soon as this date, he was a very accomplished painter. Lo and behold, there's a second portrait of the same lady. Her marriage to Juan Gabon, the governor, is dressed in exactly the same costume. Exactly the same fit waist, holding the hand of one of her sons. And as you can see, her body has not changed. And unfortunately, the second photograph was not great because you would see that she actually does look a little older. Her eyes there are little shadows under her eyes that you don't see in the first portrait. The shadows are deeper. She's a more mature woman, but still looking like an ingenue in 1792. Campeche painted many devotional paintings that I decided to show one of because of his very individual identity of, in this case, supposedly San Clemente, but he actually looks like he may have worked from life because it's a very distinctive personality. This painting also surfaced in Spain, I would say about 20 years ago. And a lot of these works went back with members of the family or were sent to Spain as a record of a member of the family who was in the New World, in the Caribbean.
What is attributes there?
What?
The attributes, is it an anchor and
An anchor and the poet's mitre. The poet's mitre and staff.
oh,
Anchor, I don't know for what reason. I don't remember why Clemente holds an anchor. So, what's more appealing than a beautiful lady on a Paso Fino parade horse? The center painting is actually a fragment. We're missing, since we painted most often on mahogany panels, they were usually actually pretty diminutive, about 16 inches high. He was almost a miniaturist in that respect. He painted many nice small pictures. The painting of Doña Maria Catalina de Urrutia is also about the same size. So we're not quite sure why two parts of the center painting are missing because the panels were not put together in pieces. They were usually one solid piece. It's very interesting with all the sitters, the subjects of the paintings whose identities we know, that we do not know the identity of any one of these three ladies. They are all distinctly different physiognomy. Their faces are totally different. Their costumes are exact replicas of each other. Their position on the horse, the hand with the riding crop, the hand with the reins, and the beautifully decorated parade horse. So there's something going on here with bodies, and we'll talk about that more. Some of you may have seen this painting years ago. I found this work in a Spanish auction catalog, unknown Spanish painter, 18th century portrait, or not even 18th century, portrait of a military officer. In an overwhelming frame. I mean, this frame was just, and it was a small photo in an auction catalog, and I immediately met the sitter's eyes, and I decided that I had to see a better photograph of this. There was something about the collar, the cravat, and his very intense gaze that led me to Campeche immediately. And it it mattered to figure out who the sitter was, but I didn't know. a collector and scholar, an autodidact, basically, someone who was Puerto Rican but had learned about these documents and paintings on his own over many, many years, Teodoro Vidal. He became a great friend and collector of some of the works that a couple of the works that I found, and he was able to identify the sitter because, like Venice in a way, it's a small island, and people were related to each other, and if you knew a family, you knew from documents approximately how old the offspring were, the wife was, the husband was, and you know what. We know this was painted in around the 1790s based on a lot of his other works. So Teodoro was actually able to identify the sitter. This was the sitter's wife. He was her second husband. She was 5 years older when they married. You can pretty much see this. Maria Gertrudis Puente was married first to Thomas O'Daly. Yes, there were lots of Irishmen in the Caribbean. And the O'Dalys, he and his brother James, were actually responsible for rebuilding some of the fortifications in San Juan. A lot of people went there as engineers and builders and merchants, of course. But we're going to talk a lot about infrastructure here. So, some of the most prominent people in Puerto Rico at the time were actually military men. Campeche seemed actually pretty fascinated by military costume and military uniforms. This is an ensign. Finally, there was a fixed regiment, a permanent regiment in Puerto Rico, and this was an arms bearer. With a standing portrait like this of a male, take a look at the shape of the body. There's something very idiosyncratic. Narrow shoulders, diminutive, almost wiry physique. Turnout. They're standing almost like ballet dancers. And again, this governor went to Puerto Rico from Barcelona, colonel, engineer director, governor, and captain general of the plaza and island of Puerto Rico. So governors were actually tasked with more than governance, more than administration. They were builders of infrastructure. They built roads, they built plazas, they built pavements, sidewalks, and buildings too. So they were the engineers who actually direct the contractors. They had project managers. They directed the projects personally, besides just governing. There's much more of a division of labor nowadays. These guys did it all. Another officer, a captain in the permanent regiment, but you see the same kind of physical features. Narrow shoulders, something either held in the hand or a gesture with his regiment behind him. And a totally distinct face. with a harpsichord, which means she probably played the harpsichord. And unfortunately, the daily lives, or lives at all, of these gentlemen, there's not much known about them. It's known where they came from. She was also Spanish, and he was a criollo born in Puerto Rico. But as far as their, shall I say, educational attributes or social attributes or personalities, we don't know much about the women. And yet, here they are immortalized in a very, in very rather intimate portraits. This would be in the governor's mansion. And where they were probably frequent visitors as military people. Another governor. Manuel Antonio Studies, again, a project manager. Behind him, I'm sorry I had to capture this on the internet, it was a videotape. Behind him, they're building sidewalks. And he is basically the project manager of the sidewalk building. But here again, we have the same type of bodily features. Very wiry guy, thin legs, turnout, gesturing, but a face that is extremely individualistic. Now, there was a doctor in Puerto Rico whom I knew actually took on some of these paintings from a medical viewpoint, and he posited about the portrait of Ustades that, well, he may have had edema of the legs, and he looked rather thin, so he may have had some nutritional challenges. And an art historian sort of contradicted that view by saying, wait, you must understand that at the time, the face was so important to get right, but the bodies were made from tailor stones, basically. And the women as well, they were dress forms. So as you can see, most of the women's bodies look very similar, and most of the men's bodies look very similar. So, and we have a portrait painter in the audience who definitely does not use tailor stonings in his portraits, but these guys all pretty much have the same body. And again, a Valerie find. This painting is on canvas, although it's quite small. And on a beautiful little stretcher. This is before conservation, when it was just taken off the canvas. However, it's in very nice condition. But again, I recognize it as Campeche. There are a lot of miniatures made around this time which sort of shrunk the bodies of the sitters. But there was something rather different about works by Campeche, and in this one, it would be the shape of his lips and his beautiful blue eyes. Another Irishman, I thought, red hair actually. Another Irishman. A woman in diaphanous dress was probably painted on the occasion of her wedding, or betrothal at least. She migrated from Spain with her mother and her stepfather in 1790 to Puerto Rico. her stepfather was a sergeant major in a division of the Spanish Navy. And she married a gentleman who became Don Benito Perez, who became governor of New Granada, which includes Ecuador, Colombia, and a few other northern South American countries. So I imagine they probably went there eventually to live. I'm going to conclude here, but show you three more paintings. Actually, in his later years, in the late 1790s and early 19th century, Campeche began to work more on canvas rather than small panels, and also in a larger size. Now, this compared to the paintings you see of the governors, for instance, 25 by 17 inches, 18 by 12, 17 by 12. They were all pretty diminutive sizes and very meticulously done. But now, suddenly, we see this. They enlarge. And they enlarge so that Campeche can work on the details, but with a slightly looser brush. This last portrait is the portrait of Governor Ramon de Castro. Is 92 inches by 64 inches. It is quite an impressive undertaking in the tradition of French and Spanish royal portraits, where they were always gesturing to a military triumph, and in this case, honestly, Ramon de Castro helped repel an invasion by the British in 1797. As was a habit of Campeche's, he painted a lot of members. He might paint a lot of members of the same family. The two girls in the center who are named here are just called the daughters of Ramon de Castro, but you can also see 45 by 32 inches. It's a big painting. And the last painting was one that I found in Spain. And it was attributed to Campeche, but there was no real indication of who the sitter was, because there are no little cartelinos or papers on the tables that delineated who she was. I studied this painting for a long time and also conferred with a scholar in Puerto Rico who wrote a monograph on the Spanish painter Panet, who Campeche knew. And I proposed to him that this lady was the wife of Ramon de Castro because of several things. She's in mourning. Their daughters died in 1804 of yellow fever. On each hand, she's wearing a double-lobed mourning ring. Her brooch is also a sign of mourning. It's a reliquary, basically, but the mourning virgin. And it was painted, we were certain, right around the first decade of the 19th century, which is when the girls died. So my friend Osiris Delgado wrote about the painting with that, naming the woman, and it was sold to the Toma collection, I would say about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. There are a lot more portraits I could show, but they're While there is a certain sameness about them because of the models that he used, the Taylor studies, etc., I can't really overestimate the importance of this man. Outside of Puerto Rico, the most collected of his works were in Venezuela. There were actually amazing collectors of art all over the Spanish Empire in Venezuela. So I think over time about 8 of his portraits or other devotional paintings have been found in Venezuela as well. Some of them have been brought back to Puerto Rico. And actually a few of the paintings that migrated back to Spain with family members then found their way back to Puerto Rico, where a lot of them are in museums. It's delightful to see more of his works show up in American collections. And of all things, the Metropolitan Museum mounted an exhibition of his work in 1988, which was the year after I went into business. And I had never seen his work. So it was a revelation to see, 25 or 30 paintings from this little guy in Puerto Rico who was practically the only painter. So it was really kind of a forward-looking exhibition at the time. And I don't know, it caught my fancy and my imagination. And I thought, I bet there are works of his, because we often find New World works in Europe. I bet there are works of his that are still floating around in Europe. And lo and behold, I have found 3 of them. Somebody asked somebody said they might have a lot of questions, and I said I probably can't answer any of them. but ask away. Yeah.
Do we have estimates of how many paintings he did during his career, and which museums have the best collections or collections that are on public view?
A lot of them are in public view in Puerto Rico, but not only in museums, at the university, at the Archbishop's Palace, in many locations besides art museums. There are, I think there's one in Philadelphia, a devotional painting in Philadelphia now, and 2 others, the one in Brooklyn, the one in Hispanic Society, the one in the Toma collection. So there are a good 4 of them in the USA, on the mainland USA, which is wonderful because we're seeing more of these works.
Then in the major exhibition in Puerto Rico.
Yes, but that was the '88 exhibition was in Ponce, in Puerto Rico, and at the Metropolitan. Yeah, it was shared by the 2. And by the way, I do believe the Hispanic Society in New York is planning a major exhibition of his work, and I don't know the exact date. Renee, I'm sorry.
We're talking about the use of Taylor studies to model the bodies in these paintings. Does that mean that the practice of kind of painting, and then putting the face a little later was also used in Puerto Rico, like
Yeah.
in the Americas?
Yeah, and it was actually also done in Europe. I mean, a painter might use exactly the same composition in 5 equestrian portraits, because those things were not only in the Royal Palace in Paris or in Madrid, they were painted as kind of replicas and spread all over large cities in Spain or in France or in England. But the importance of our painter to Puerto Rico might be compared to the importance of a painter like John Singleton Copley in the United States, Gainsborough and Reynolds in England, or Goya in Spain. I mean, he was that important.
With that sameness of form in the body, how do you decipher
body, how do you determine who the sitter is, just by a face or papers or attributes, or how do you determine that?
Some of the paintings are inscribed. Some of the paintings are inscribed with the sitter's name. Obviously, the ones that are interiors, you know the building. You know, if you're a scholar or studying these works, you know the building that he's standing in. So that would lead you to. But in this case, I think he's holding a map of the city of San Juan. So we know that's exactly where he is. And many of them are inscribed with the sitter's name, with the subject's name. Anybody else?
Valerie, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So, Karen died before him. So we've got, what influences his work after his mentor dies? Because you talk about him like
After who dies?
his mentor. You compare it,
Or
because
he didn't die, he went back to Spain.
okay, so he went back to Spain. But the point is that he's working in an environment where there's only him, and it's remarkable that he's so good with no other guidance.
Thank you. That's why I say that his importance can't be overestimated. The man lived in a visual culture desert. There were certainly visitors and maybe even painter visitors to Puerto Rico during the time that he lived. But there was no artistic community. There was nothing. He was on his own. His development as a portrait painter is nothing short of profound, really, for the lack of influence.
And another question.
Yeah.
If I go to the Denver Art Museum, in the good old days anyway, and I went up to the colonial floor, there are certainly portraits, for example, from Mexico from this period.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a preponderance, number one, of religious paintings,
Because
things
that's what
pertaining
the preponderance was.
things pertaining to nuns and convents, and then a special kind of subject about the castas. And then if you go to Peru, there's a special kind of subject about the Inca rulers. It's very interesting. You go to Puerto Rico, he clearly did some religious paintings, but he was also clearly associated with with Puerto Rican society, meaning the governors, and they wanted pictures of themselves for whatever reason, and less so religious stuff, even though I'm sure people were quite devout in Puerto Rico, just as in Mexico. But maybe, as you suggested, in Mexico, there were traditions of families of painters, dynasties, that did religious paintings, and he's a one-man show.
Yeah.
Except Harry was there to show him essentially society art.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that not only through Harry, eventually, he probably met some of his patrons, but also through his father's and his own association with the cathedral, because everyone went to the cathedral. David, have you asked how many paintings he made, or am I
There are
not?
estimates of his total body.
There are estimates, and one of them is about 300 paintings. And a lot of those works will be devotional, and they'll be found in churches all over Puerto Rico, and there are a few now in the United States in private collections, and there's one in Philadelphia.
You mentioned Teodoro Vidal, and I was wondering if you could speak for a few minutes about his significance in relation to Senor Campeche and Senor Vidal's works.
You You mean his collection?
His collection of his
Yeah.
publications.
Yeah. Yes, as a matter of fact, it's a funny environment there. Our friend and scholar Michael Brown, who was here in Denver for about 5 years as a Mayor Fellow, came to me actually before he wrote his dissertation at New York University and said, "I'm thinking of doing my dissertation on Jose Campeche. What do you think?" And I discouraged him because the scholars in Puerto Rico are not terribly collegial. There are a few people who've been working in documents on his works for many decades. One, Arturo Davila, had promised to write the definitive volume, the catalog raisonné, so to speak, of Jose Campeche. He is an aged man. I don't know if he's still alive, and the book is not written. Teodoro, who was taught himself, basically, and collected Puerto Rican folk art and Campeche's works, and other works that are of not as interesting artistic value, but there were a few little painters around that painted small portraits, like miniature portraits. And Teodoro, at long last, has actually published a lot of the documentary information, the deep stuff that you don't find anywhere else. And he was the friend of governors. He was a businessman himself, a very accomplished individual. And there's an intelligentsia there that is very conservative, very old-fashioned, and I would not think of addressing him as anything but Don Teodoro. And in the age of a pretty profane culture in a lot of parts of the world, I've got to tell you that is a very comforting respect to pay to an elder person. Someone whose accomplishments in life are worthy of the title Don. And it's not just Mr. It's a lot more reverent than that. Okay, so, are we all set?
That was brilliant.